My fiancé ended our engagement in front of almost 200 people, 47 days before our wedding. And somehow, that wasn't even the worst thing he did that night. Evan was standing on stage at the biggest event his family's auction house hosted all year. Collectors, museum directors, insurance executives, attorneys. Private buyers with enough money to spend more on one painting than most people would earn in a lifetime. He had just been promoted to vice president of operations at Cole and Ash, the auction house his family had owned for 3 generations. Everyone was applauding him. Then the host smiled and asked, "And the wedding is coming up soon too, right?" I was sitting near the back of the ballroom. Our finalized wedding seating chart was still in my bag. 120 guests, an oceanfront ceremony, a white tent, gardenias because they were my mother's favorite flowers. 47 days away. Evan looked directly at me. Then he smiled. "Well, we've actually been rethinking that." At first, I honestly thought I had heard him wrong. The host laughed awkwardly. "Rethinking the wedding?" Evan gave a small shrug. "Mara is a great person. We've just realized lately that we may not see the future the same way." The room became quieter. I stared at him. He had never told me any of this. Not once. Not that morning. Not the night before. Not when he asked me to confirm our wedding seating chart less than 24 hours earlier. The host clearly realized something had gone very wrong, so he tried to move on. "Mara works in the art world too, doesn't she?" Evan glanced toward me. "Kind of. She helps museums with storage, transportation, restoration support, things like that." Then he laughed. "If you want the simple version, she deals with crates." A few people laughed, not loudly, but I heard them. Evan kept going. "She likes quiet work. I've always thought that was fine. Not everyone has to be ambitious." That one hurt. Not because I needed a room full of wealthy strangers to respect me, because the man saying it had slept beside me for 7 years. He had watched me leave the house at 2 in the morning because a museum roof had collapsed. He had watched me build my company from a rented warehouse with a leaking ceiling. And somehow, in his version of our life, I had become the woman who moved boxes. I didn't stand up. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my ring at him. I just sat there. Because less than 10 minutes later, the entire night changed. The ballroom doors opened. Cole and Ash's lead insurance advisor hurried inside. He went directly to Evan's father, one whisper, then another, and suddenly staff members began shutting down the main gallery. The auction preview stopped. Guests were asked to step away from the artwork. People started asking questions. Nobody answered. Evan came off the stage. His father looked like someone had just told him the building was on fire. Then I heard the words that made me sit up. "There's a provenance issue with Lot 17. Lot 17, the painting everyone had been talking about for months, a late work by French impressionist Julien Moreau. Estimated value? $70 million. 3 major buyers were already preparing to bid. One museum had even arranged international transportation in advance." Evan asked, "What happens now?" The insurance advisor answered, "The underwriter won't allow the sale to continue without an independent provenance review." Evan's father asked, "Who can clear it?" The answer was one word: ArcLight. Evan barely reacted. I did, because ArcLight Art Recovery and Provenance was my company. Not the company I worked for. Not one of my clients. Mine. I started it 5 years earlier with my entire savings account, 2 credit cards, and 3 part-time conservators. Last year, ArcLight brought in $28 million. This year, we already had close to $40 million in signed contracts. We worked with 19 major museums, 6 insurance groups, and dozens of private collections, and Evan's family had no idea. More importantly, Evan didn't seem to know either. The insurance advisor said, "I don't know if anyone from ArcLight can get here tonight." That was when I stood up. "Someone can." Several people turned toward me. I walked across the ballroom. Evan stared at me. His father stared at me. I stopped beside the advisor. "ArcLight's managing director is already here." Evan's father frowned. "Who?" I looked at him. "Me." For 5 full seconds, nobody said anything. Then Evan asked the question I will probably remember for the rest of my life. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I looked at the man I had been planning to marry, and suddenly I realized something. He knew what coffee I drank. He knew I hated raisins. He knew I slept with the bedroom window cracked open, even in winter. He knew which side of the bed I preferred. He knew every detail about the wedding he had just publicly put on hold, but he had no idea what I actually did every day. And that should have been enough to tell me our relationship was already over. It wasn't. Because by 2 o'clock that morning, Evan would ask me to ignore a serious problem so his family could still make the sale. And the next afternoon, I would discover something even worse. For years, the same man who told people I basically moved crates from museums had been quietly using my professional work to make his family's company look more successful. He knew exactly how valuable I was, he just didn't want anyone else to know. My name is Mara Bennett. I was 32 years old when this happened. And 47 days before the wedding I thought I wanted, I finally started seeing the man I was about to marry clearly. 7 years earlier, though, Evan had been a completely different person. That was what made leaving him so hard. We met in the basement of a small community art museum after a pipe burst during winter. The storage room had flooded. More than 20 paintings and a large collection of paper archives were exposed to water. I was 25. I had recently left a large conservation company. I had spent almost 8 hours kneeling on a concrete floor in waterproof pants, trying to separate damp paper before it dried in the wrong shape. My hair was a mess. My gloves smelled like wet cardboard. I hadn't eaten since breakfast. Evan arrived representing Coal and Ash because one of their clients had pieces stored there. He showed up in a dark coat and expensive leather shoes. 10 minutes later, both shoes were soaked. I looked at him. "If you're staying down here, you should probably take those off." He looked at the water, then at me. Then, to my surprise, he actually removed them. For the next 3 hours, Evan Cole stood in dirty museum water, wearing socks that probably cost more than my entire outfit. He helped carry frames, he held flashlights, he labeled boxes. He never once complained. Late that night, we moved the last group of paperworks into a temporary drying room. He asked, "Why do you like doing this?" I said, "Because sometimes you only get one chance to save something. If you miss the right window, it's gone." He looked around at the damaged pieces. "That sounds stressful." "It is." I paused. "But it matters." A week later, he asked me for coffee. 3 months later, we were dating. Back then, Evan respected what I did. If a museum called me at 2 in the morning, he would help me find my coat. If I had a 6 a.m. flight, he would drive me to the airport. Once, after I worked for almost 30 hours straight, I came home, sat down by the front door, and fell asleep without even taking off my shoes. Evan moved me to the couch. The next morning, he gave me a new pair of waterproof work boots. Inside the box was a note, for saving things before it's too late. I kept that note for 6 years. When I started ArcLight, Evan knew about it. There wasn't much to hide. Our first office was inside a rented warehouse. We had 3 second-hand desks, a folding table, 1 coffee maker, and a ceiling that leaked every time it rained hard. I used all of my savings. Then I used 2 credit cards. My first 3 employees were technically contractors because I couldn't afford full salaries yet. The first year, we lost $90,000. The second year, we barely broke even. I remember sitting in my car one night outside the warehouse, looking at our bank balance and wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Evan called. I told him I was fine. He knew I wasn't. He drove over with takeout. We sat on the warehouse floor eating noodles out of paper containers. He said, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. If this works, great. If it doesn't, you'll figure something else out." I believed him. I believed he meant it. Then in our third year, a hurricane damaged several museum collections along the coast. ArcLight was hired by 3 institutions at the same time. We worked almost non-stop for 6 weeks. It was the project that changed the company. One museum recommended us to another. Then an insurance group hired us to create a disaster response plan. Then a private collection asked us to evaluate transportation risk for several paintings traveling between Europe and the United States. Suddenly, ArcLight wasn't surviving anymore. It was growing. By the end of that year, I was earning more than Evan. And that was when something between us changed, not all at once. That would have been easier at first. It was small. A friend would ask how work was going. I might say, "We just signed a new museum." Evan would immediately add, "Her kind of business comes in waves." Or someone would ask, "Is ArcLight your company?" And Evan would answer, "She's pretty involved." Not, "She founded it." The first time I corrected him, he laughed. I just didn't feel like explaining the whole thing. I believed him for a while. Then there was a dinner at a collector's house. One of the guests recognized my name from a large fire recovery project ArcLight had handled. He asked me about it. Then another person joined the conversation. For maybe 20 minutes, most of the table was asking me questions. How do you recover smoke-damaged canvas? How do you decide whether an artwork can travel? How do insurers evaluate restoration risk? I answered because they asked. I wasn't bragging. I wasn't trying to take over the dinner. But on the drive home, Evan barely spoke. I finally asked, "What's wrong?" "Nothing." We reached the parking garage. He turned off the engine. Then he said, "Do you always have to bring your work into every social situation?" I stared at him. They asked me. "I know. So what should I have done?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You don't have to tell people everything." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was terrible, because I listened to it. After that, I started talking less. When someone asked how ArcLight was doing, I said, "Fine." When someone asked what I did, I said, "Art recovery and consulting." When people wanted details, I sometimes changed the subject. I told myself I was being considerate. Looking back, that was probably the first time I made myself smaller to protect a man's ego. 2 years before the gala, Evan got another promotion. A few months later, we got engaged. I thought that meant whatever weirdness existed between us had finally settled. Instead, it got worse. His mother, Diane, invited me to lunch alone. She told me the Cole family lived a very public life. There would be more business dinners, more charity events, more private previews, more photographs, more people paying attention to who I was. Then she asked, "Have you ever thought about doing something a little more stable?" I laughed because I thought she meant money. ArcLight is pretty stable. She smiled. "Mara, I'm not talking about income. I mean your image." I didn't know what to say, she explained. I traveled with very little notice. I wore practical clothes. I skipped social events if a museum had an emergency. Sometimes I had paint dust on my shoes. Sometimes I took phone calls at dinner because a collection manager needed an answer. In Diane's mind, that wasn't how the future daughter-in-law of a major auction family was supposed to live. I went home and told Evan. I expected him to think it was ridiculous. Instead, he said, "She said it badly, but she's not completely wrong." I looked at him. "About what?" "Our life is going to become more public. You could adjust a few things." "Like what?" He hesitated. "Clothes, social stuff. Maybe your schedule." I stared at him. "My schedule?" He gave a tired sigh. "I'm not saying quit. I'm just saying maybe don't let everyone meet you for the first time and think you're part of the loading crew." That hurt more than I wanted to admit, but I didn't argue. We had just gotten engaged. I told myself this was what adults did. You compromised. You adjusted. You made room for each other. The problem was, the adjustments slowly became one-sided. Wedding tasting, I showed up. Diane changed half the menu. I said, "Okay." Wedding venue? They moved it to the private hotel the Cole family always used. I said, "Okay." Guest list, 80 people became 120. I said, "Okay." Evan wanted me to stop accepting out-of-state emergency work for the 2 weeks before the wedding. I rearranged 3 major ArcLight projects. I assigned other directors to cover them. I said okay. At some point I realized I had said okay so many times that I couldn't remember the last time Evan had changed something for me. I pushed that thought away. Then came the gala. The night he received his promotion. The night he told almost 200 people we were rethinking our wedding. The night he told them I moved crates. The night his family's $70 million painting suddenly needed the approval of the company I had built. We worked on Lot 17 until almost 2 in the morning. The first review showed no immediate evidence that the painting itself was fake. That was important, but authenticity wasn't the whole problem. The provenance documents had a 12-year gap. That alone was not unusual. Old paintings often have incomplete histories, but one private letter being used to close part of that gap looked wrong. The paper didn't match the claimed date. The ink needed further testing, and then we discovered something worse. 2 months earlier, someone inside Cole and Ash had requested a change to the risk note attached to the lot. The original note said, "Provenance incomplete. Further verification required later." It had been changed to, "Documentation sufficient for private sale." Those sentences sounded similar if you didn't know what you were looking at. Professionally, they meant very different things. The first one said, "We are not done." The second one said, "We have enough." On a $70 million painting, that difference mattered. If the sale went through and the ownership history later failed, the consequences would spread everywhere. The buyer could challenge the transaction, the insurer could deny coverage, the bank financing the purchase could get involved, a museum could end up holding a work it could not ethically display, Cole and Ash could face lawsuits, so our recommendation was simple. Hold Lot 17, allow the unrelated pieces to move forward, investigate the documents properly. When I signed the temporary report, most of the staff had already gone home. Evan was still waiting in an office. I walked in. He closed the door. "You know how important tonight was for me." I looked at him. "I know." "Then why couldn't you give us a little time?" "For what?" He leaned forward to let the sale go through. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood. "You already said the painting is probably real? That's not the only issue. The paperwork can be fixed after?" "No," he became frustrated. "Mara, this isn't some internal rule at your little company." I stared at him. "Little company?" He immediately knew. I didn't mean it like that. But he had, maybe not consciously, but he had. I asked, "Do you know how large Arclight is?" He didn't answer. "Do you know how many projects we handled last year?" Nothing. "Do you know how many museum disaster plans were written by my team?" Nothing. "Do you know that Cole and Ash has been through 4 insurance reviews in the last 3 years where an Arclight consultant signed the final report?" His expression changed. He hadn't known. And suddenly the entire thing felt absurd. 7 years. He knew how I took my coffee. He knew I hated raisins. He knew I had to sleep with the window cracked. He knew what shampoo I used. He knew I cried every time I watched one specific old movie with my mother, but he did not know how I spent most of my waking life. Not because I hid it. Because somewhere along the way, he stopped asking. I looked at him. "Why did you announce tonight that the wedding was on hold?" He rubbed his forehead. "We've had problems for a while." "Then why did you ask me yesterday to confirm the seating chart?" He said nothing, and I understood. "You already decided?" A few seconds passed. Then he said, "I just never found the right time." I actually laughed. "So the stage felt right?" "That's not what happened," the host asked. I didn't want to keep pretending. "Pretending?" He looked away. I felt something inside me go quiet. Then I asked the one question I had been trying not to ask. "Is there someone else?" "No, too fast." I watched him. He didn't say anything else. I didn't ask again, because by that point, another woman would only have been one more detail. The bigger truth was already clear. He had been planning a future without me while I was still planning our wedding. I took off my engagement ring. I placed it on his desk. "Mara, don't do this." I looked at him. "You did this tonight." Then I left. I thought that would be the worst thing I learned. It wasn't. The next afternoon, Arclight's compliance team was organizing the Cole and Ash documents connected to Lot 17. One of my directors sent me a file. "Did you approve this?" I opened it. It was a Cole and Ash internal presentation. 3 pages looked familiar immediately. Too familiar. They were risk management procedures I had helped Evan revise 2 years earlier. I had made the charts. I had cleaned up the language. I had explained how the categories should be divided. At the time, Evan told me it was just for internal training. I didn't charge him. Why would I? We were getting married. I kept reading. Those same pages had later been included in formal materials Cole and Ash sent to an insurance company. My name was gone. Arclight's name was gone, the title said. Cole and Ash Proprietary Risk Framework. Then I found more. Humidity response procedures, transportation risk classifications, emergency protocols for high-value collections, all of it came from material I had helped Evan with over the years. Some of it was general. Some of it was based on confidential client work. I sat at my desk staring at the screen, and something clicked. Evan had spent years telling people my job wasn't that serious. He had told his mother I needed a better image. He had told people I was involved with Arclight instead of saying I founded it. He had just joked that I moved crates, yet behind the scenes he had been using my work to make his family's company look more professional. That hurt more than the possibility of another woman, because it meant he understood my value perfectly. He just preferred the value without my name attached to it. I sent everything to my attorney, not because I wanted to destroy anyone. There were client confidentiality issues involved. Arclight had an obligation to protect that material. My attorney sent Cole and Ash a formal notice. Stop using unlicensed material, remove client-specific information, correct the attribution on anything they were legally allowed to keep. I didn't ask for damages. I didn't ask for a public apology, but Evan's father found out. 3 days later, he asked to meet with me. I almost declined. Then I went. He looked exhausted. I didn't know those materials came from you. I looked at him. Your family seems to not know a lot of things. He didn't argue. Then he told me what had happened with Lot 17. Evan had not personally changed the risk note. A senior manager in private sales had done it. The man was worried that delaying the transaction would hurt the company's annual numbers. So he softened the language. But Evan had seen the final file. He had noticed the wording changed, and he never asked why. Because Lot 17 was supposed to be the biggest sale connected to his new role. I wasn't surprised. That was the person Evan had slowly become. He didn't always choose the wrong thing. Sometimes he just chose not to look closely when the truth might slow him down. Cole and Ash eventually removed Lot 17 from that season's auction. The private sales manager left the company. The insurer and potential buyers were notified. Evan did not lose his entire career. His promotion wasn't taken away, but his father removed him from high-risk private sales. He could no longer make final decisions on those transactions. He still had money. He still had a job. He still had his family. Real life did not destroy him overnight. But for the first time, he had to live with a consequence. So did I. For the first month after our breakup, I barely slept. During the day, I looked completely normal. I went to meetings, reviewed reports, approved budgets, got on planes, talked to clients. Nobody at ArcLight knew how bad I felt at night. Sometimes I would walk into my kitchen and automatically take out 2 mugs. Then I would remember, there was only one person living there now. One evening I opened my closet and saw the waterproof boots Evan had given me years earlier. I sat on the floor and cried for almost an hour. I wasn't crying for the man who embarrassed me at the gala. I was crying for the man who once took off his expensive shoes and stood in dirty museum water to help me save damaged paintings. That is one of the hardest parts of leaving someone. Sometimes you are not grieving who they are now, you are grieving who they used to be. 3 months later, I received the final refund from our wedding hotel. I had already blocked 2 weeks off for the honeymoon, so I kept the time, and I went to Maine by myself. No laptop, no client calls, no museum emergencies. I walked. I ate. I slept. For the first few days, I barely knew what to do with myself. Then I started thinking about a question I had avoided for years. Why had I tolerated so much after Evan started changing? The answer wasn't flattering. Part of me liked being the easy woman. Low maintenance. Understanding. Flexible. Not dramatic. If someone said, "I'm under a lot of pressure," I immediately moved my own feelings to the bottom of the list. If Evan came home in a bad mood, I became quieter. If he felt insecure about my work, I talked about it less. If his mother criticized me, I tried harder to fit in. I thought that made me mature. It didn't. Eventually, I realized maturity is not the same thing as always giving in. Sometimes maturity sounds like, "No, that hurt. I'm not comfortable with this." When I came back from Maine, ArcLight took on a new project. A small maritime museum more than 100 years old was preparing to reopen after major flood prevention work. They hired us to design a new collection protection system. The architect overseeing the building was Adrian 36, historic preservation specialist. I had technically known Adrian for years, but only professionally. He was very different from Evan. Adrian didn't walk into a room needing everyone to know how smart he was. When someone else spoke, he listened. When he didn't know something, he said, "I don't know." During one of our first site visits, Adrian noticed there might be moisture trapped inside an old wall. The contractor said, "It's probably fine." Adrian looked at him. "Probably isn't data." Then he ordered another test. I liked working with him immediately. Not romantically. Not yet. It was just easy. 5 months after Evan and I broke up, the project ended. A few days later, Adrian sent me a text. "If I ask you to dinner and promise not to bring blueprints, is that against company policy?" I stared at the message and laughed. I wrote, "Depends on the restaurant." He replied, "Pizza," I said. "I'll consider it." Our first date was completely ordinary. No flowers, no expensive restaurant. We went to a loud little pizza place. He ordered the wrong drink for me. I corrected him. He looked offended. "Losing points already? So far?" Can I earn them back? We'll see. For a long time, dating Adrian felt strange. I kept wondering if something was missing. There was no guessing, no silent treatment, no intentionally late replies, no weird mood after I shared good news, no feeling that I had to measure every sentence before I said it. The first time I told him ArcLight had signed a contract with a major European museum network, he stood up, opened the refrigerator, and asked, "Champagne or ice cream?" I laughed. "You're not worried I'm working too much?" He looked at me. "Are you asking if I miss you? Or are you asking if I think you should be less successful?" I didn't know what to say. He continued, "I miss you. That's my feeling. It doesn't mean you should do less of something you care about." It was such a simple sentence, but I thought about it for days. A person could miss me without asking me to become smaller, just to make that feeling easier for them. Almost a year into our relationship, Adrian was offered a major project in Paris. If he accepted, he would need to live there for 7 months. He didn't immediately reject it, and he didn't assume I would follow him. He came to my apartment with the email open on his laptop. "I want to do it," I said. "Then you should." He nodded. "We should talk about what that means for us." My body tensed immediately, old instincts. I expected him to say long distance was too hard, that ArcLight made me too tied to the United States, that maybe we needed to rethink things. Instead, he said, "I don't want us to pretend 7 months will be easy just to prove our relationship is strong. We can see each other once a month. We can schedule calls. If 3 months in, something isn't working, we adjust. But I'm not asking you to put ArcLight on hold and follow me. And I don't want to reject a project I care about because I'm scared distance might be difficult." I sat there listening to him, and I realized this was what I used to think a mature relationship looked like. Not one person constantly sacrificing. Two people with their own lives, their own work, their own goals, and enough respect to ask, how do we make room for both? 7 months later, Adrian came home. There was no dramatic airport reunion. I picked him up. He threw his suitcase into my trunk, then said, "I am never eating another airport sandwich." I laughed so hard I almost forgot to start the car. A year later, the Maritime Museum officially reopened. The same place where we had worked together before our first date. After the opening event ended and everyone went home, Adrian took me back to the wall where he had first found the moisture problem. It had been completely restored. An old harbor map hung there now. Then Adrian reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small box. I looked at him. He said, "Don't panic. I'm not proposing in front of a crowd. It's just us." I said, "Okay, keep going." He opened the box. There was a simple ring inside. Then he said, "Mara, I don't need you to prove that you need me. You don't. And I don't want to be the most important thing in your life." That surprised me. He continued, "I want to be a very important part of it. But not all of it. Your work is yours. Your friends are yours. Your life is yours. And if you want, we can make part of it ours." I started crying. Then, because apparently I am still myself even during a proposal, I asked, "Did you talk to my attorney about a prenup?" He stared at me for 2 seconds, then laughed. "I did." He said, "You should choose your own attorney." That made me cry even harder. "You're terrible at romance." He smiled. "I think this is romantic. I want you to know every day that you're staying because you want to. Not because leaving would cost too much." That was when I said yes. Our wedding had 46 guests. Not 120. We didn't use a Cole family hotel. We got married on a small lawn beside the Maritime Museum. My ArcLight team came. Adrian's architecture team came. My mother was there. A few people who had known me since the early days of ArcLight came too. Before the ceremony, I was alone in the small room where I was getting ready. I opened an old box. Inside was the note Evan had placed in the waterproof boots all those years earlier. For saving things before it's too late, I held it for a long time. Then I put it back. I didn't tear it up. I didn't throw it away. Because that relationship wasn't fake. Evan really did love me once. And I really did love him. We simply became two people who no longer fit together. He became more and more dependent on outside approval. I became less and less willing to turn my life into a performance. What destroyed us wasn't the fact that I made more money. It wasn't Lot 17, it wasn't one auction, it wasn't even the cruel things he said on stage. What destroyed us happened slowly for years. I kept turning myself down so he could feel comfortable. I talked less. I celebrated less. I asked for less, I made myself easier, smaller, quieter. For a long time, I believed that was simply the price of love. I still believe love has a cost. Healthy love does too. It costs time. It requires compromise. It requires hard conversations. Sometimes it means getting on a long flight because you haven't seen each other in a month. Sometimes it means waiting while someone finishes an exhausting project. Sometimes it means coming back to finish a conversation when you're still angry. But there are things love should never cost you: your dignity, your ability, your dreams, your voice, your trust in your own judgment. Those things should never be the price you pay to keep someone beside you. It took me 7 years to understand that. If someone only starts looking at you differently after other people tell them how important you are, you did not suddenly become valuable. They just were not paying attention before. The right person does not need to wait until you own a company, until people know your name, until you have money, until a room full of powerful people thinks you are impressive. They can see you when you are wearing dirty work pants, when your hair is a mess, when you're sitting on the floor of a warehouse eating cold pizza. They know who you are then too. Years ago, Evan wrote something in that little note. Some things have to be saved before it's too late. For years, I thought he was talking about art. Now I know that sentence was really about me. I didn't save our engagement. I didn't save the wedding. I didn't save the future we had planned, but before it was too late, I saved myself. And love means something very different to me now. It is no longer what would you do without me. It is, I know you could build a good life without me. And if you want me there, I'd still love to build one beside you.